The survival of any body of literary work depends, or at least depended prior to the advent of the internet, on print. We've seen that by the end of his own century, the 17th century, Shakespeare was becoming increasingly popular on stage. Portraits of him were beginning to be painted, and critics were beginning to write in admiration about him, although there were still some doubts. The first folio of his collected works that had been published in 1623 after his death by his fellow actors had been reprinted in 1632, again in 1664, and again in the 1680s. What was needed, though, was an edition of his work that modernised the spelling. The English language had evolved, particularly in its spelling and punctuation, since Shakespeare's time. And so it was that early in the 18th century, a dramatist, writer called Nicholas Rowe produced the first modern edition of Shakespeare. Instead of the old double columns and old spelling of the folio, the book was handsomely laid out in 6 volumes, the spelling was modernised, and it had the feel of a contemporary work. Crucially, Rowe also included in his edition a life of Shakespeare, the works of Mr. William Shakespeare in 6 volumes, revised and corrected, with an account of the life and writings of the author by N. Rowe, 1709. This was the first occasion in which Shakespeare's biography was told, although a lot of it relied on hearsay and gossip rather than documentary evidence. So Rowe established the tradition of the scholarly, complete works of Shakespeare, and he was succeeded by a variety of other 18th century editors, often poets and writers themselves. And by the end of the 18th century, any decent gentleman's library would include a fine leather-bound set of Shakespeare's complete works, accurately edited from the original texts, but with notes to explain the obsolete words, the historical references. In the theatre, the plays were being performed more and more, but the versions in which they were performed were not the same as those in the print editions of people like Rowe and his successors, such as Alexander Pope. In the theatre, the plays were adapted to conform to the conventions of the new age. And I've got a range of theatrical editions here. So these are the scripts, published versions of the scripts of the plays as they were performed in the late 17th and 18th century theatre. And they're not at all how we would imagine them from reading the authentic texts. Here's the history of King Lear, acted at the Queen's Theatre, revived with alterations by N. Tate. That was the writer Nahum Tate, and his version of King Lear had a happy ending in which Lear is restored to the throne and Cordelia, his virtuous daughter, is married off to Edgar. As far as Nahum Tate was concerned, a tragedy should include the painful deaths of villainous characters, but the reward of virtuous characters. Cordelia is the virtuous daughter. She shouldn't be allowed to die, as she is in Shakespeare's original text, so the text must be changed. Poetic justice must be done. Cordelia must survive. Then we have Macbeth. Well, Shakespeare had changed the original Weird Sisters from Holinshed's Chronicles, but his witches got changed even more in the late 17th century theatre. This is Macbeth, a tragedy with all the alterations, amendments, additions, and new songs as it is now acted at the Duke's Theatre. Because we now have indoor theatres instead of the outdoor playhouse, there is a lot of potential for spectacular stage machinery. You could fly your witches in on broomsticks. And if you're going to have flying witches, you may as well give them a few songs. This is Macbeth as musical theatre. Or we have Richard III, the actor-manager Colley Cibber, a great celebrity of the early 18th century theatre, produced his version, The Tragical History of King Richard III as it is acted at the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane, containing the distresses and death of King Henry VI. Wait a minute, the death of King Henry VI occurs in the play King Henry VI. It doesn't occur in Richard III. What Cibber has done is raid Shakespeare's earlier play, Henry VI, Part 3, for some big chunky speeches for Richard III before he becomes king. Cibber, who played the part of Richard himself, wanted to maximise his own role. He also added in a few choice lines that Shakespeare never wrote. When he dismisses his sometime follower, the Duke of Buckingham, he says, "Off with his head, so much for Buckingham." It became a very famous line, but it was Cibber's, not Shakespeare's. When Laurence Olivier made a film of Richard III after the Second World War, he still included that line from the Cibber adaptation. By the time we get to the 1770s, nearly all Shakespeare's plays are back in the theatrical repertoire, but the great majority of them are in these versions that have been subtly altered. Either the language has been changed or the plot, in order to make them more suitable to the 18th century theatre. Romeo and Juliet, for instance, now has a balcony instead of a window. And in the 1770s, a man of the theatre called John Bell produced a whole series of editions. This one is a copy of Othello, a tragedy by Shakespeare, as performed at the Theatre Royal Drury Lane, reprinted from the prompt book with permission of the managers by Mr. Hopkins, the prompter. So if you were a keen Shakespearean towards the end of the 18th century, you could have two completely different sets of the complete works on your shelves: your reading text and your performance text. Probably the reading text you would have preferred would have been that of the greatest man of letters of the age, Dr. Samuel Johnson. In 1765, he produced his complete Shakespeare in 8 volumes, replete with notes, with explanatory notes, but also critical commentaries on the plays. And he began it with a magnificent preface in which he spoke of Shakespeare's greatness as a writer. Here, Dr. Johnson once and for all refuted the old French criticism, the neoclassical criticism, that you shouldn't mingle tragedy and comedy, you shouldn't have kings and clowns in the same play. Dr. Johnson says, but Shakespeare's plays are not really either tragedies or comedies. Rather, they are realistic plays that show us life as it is. In real life, tragic things and comic things go on together. Johnson says, in real life, one group of people are returning from a funeral at the same time that another group of people are going off to the pub. That's what life is like. Shakespeare doesn't conform to the rules of art as laid down in classical times, but rather he holds up a mirror to nature. This is what Johnson says in his preface. Nothing can please many and please long, but just representations of general nature. Shakespeare is above all writers the poet of nature, the poet that holds up to his readers a faithful mirror of manners and of life. His characters are the genuine progeny of common humanity, such as the world will always supply and observation will always find. Shakespeare's characters then show us human beings as they really are. Johnson says we can read Shakespeare and find characters who we will see in the world around us. They are genuinely universal. And it is with this idea of Shakespeare as a universal genius that his centrality to the literary tradition of the West was fully established in the mid-18th century.